Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. This is my first time in Binghamton, and I've been debating with friends whether it's Binghamton or Binghamton, and I'm not sure yet. So which one is it? Binghamton. Okay, Binghamton. All right. And it's really great because we've been planning this for some time, and I've been looking forward to it. And I really want to thank all the co-sponsors and organizers for all the hard work they put in to put this event together. And thank you all for turning out. I hope to make this an interesting and useful evening. And if I don't, I'm sure there are those here who will let me know. So we should have plenty of time for questions and discussion. And I would really like to encourage that as much as possible, knowing, of course, that this is a subject on which many of us have very strong feelings, and we want everyone to be heard, and to allow an opportunity for everyone to be heard. And I'm going to do my best to allow that to happen. The title I gave for tonight's talk, Palestine, Israel, the end of the road for the two-state solution, with a question mark, I think really sums up where I think we need to be moving our thinking on this 100-year-old conflict in Palestine and Israel, a strange conflict which consumes so much attention from the world, which destabilizes an entire segment of the world, which dominates the feelings of perhaps 1 billion or 1.5 billion people in the world, and which continues to claim innocent lives of many people, of Palestinians and Israelis, on a daily basis. Can we bring this 100-year-old conflict to an end? Why have so many efforts to do so failed? And what does the future hold? And what role does it imply for those of us here in this country who desperately want to see peace and justice for Israelis and Palestinians? Traditionally, when we have these sorts of presentations or discussions, and I've been in sort of every format, from debates with a pro-Israel speaker to panel discussions to lectures like tonight, we all put forward our sense of the history. I know very well the Palestinian narrative, which now I think is understood by most of the world, that for the state of Israel to exist, it necessitated the displacement of most of the Palestinian population from their homeland. And most of us have heard the Israeli narrative of a fractured and scattered people returning to a homeland that they cherish. And in a sense, these narratives are irreconcilable. We can find common points or agree on common things, but in a sense, nothing I hear will change my knowledge of the history, and it's possible that nothing I can say can convince those who are absolutely determined to have their version of it, to see it from a different perspective. And in a sense, it doesn't matter. Supposing that the Palestinian version of history, as told by Palestinians and as increasingly told by Israeli historians who've come to reveal, using Israeli sources, the truth of the experiences of Palestinians, even if that's 100% right or 100% wrong, it doesn't make any difference. If the official Israeli version of history is 100% right or 100% wrong, it doesn't really take us very far, because the reality today is that in the area of Palestine, whatever you want to call it, Eretz Israel, the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, that today comprises Israel, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip, that territory today has in it two groups of people, roughly equal in number. There are roughly 4.8 million Israeli Jews and roughly 4.8 million Palestinians. And neither of those groups is going to disappear. Neither will get up and leave voluntarily, and neither can be bombed out or forced out by any means. Now, there's a whole industry devoted to trying to convince us, to try to find explanations for why these two groups are fighting. There's one set of explanations which requires you to believe that one group of people is simply bad, that they're bad people, they hate life, they hate peace, they're attracted to violence and terrorism, and they reject all good things on God's earth. And that the other group is good, noble, ethical, inspired only by the most noble virtues, and is beset by this group of bad people who simply refuse to let it live in peace. And so you have on a whole set of think tanks in this country and in Israel that try to persuade you that the reason Palestinians feel antipathy towards Israel is because of their school textbooks, because of what their parents are telling them, because of the sermons they're hearing in the mosque. In other words, it has nothing to do with their day-to-day experience. You have another set of explanations which requires you essentially to believe in magic, that there is a magician, a wizard, let's say, who looks like all the storybook wizards in a way, an elderly man with white hair and a little scraggly beard, and he lives in a castle, and even though he's in very ill health, he's the puppet master who controls the entire world. Of course, I'm talking about Yasser Arafat. So one of the main themes of commentary in this country is that Yasser Arafat is the blockage which prevents us having peace. I was recently on the radio with an Israeli government representative in Chicago who asked the rhetorical question, for how long will Yasser Arafat continue to control the lives of millions of Israelis and Palestinians? This is the embodiment of the magic explanation, that a man who lives in a pile of rubble, completely surrounded by the Israeli army, who at the height of his power controlled a quasi-authority with really minimal power, but who today controls essentially nothing. But this man alone has the power to control everything. It really requires you to believe in magic. So you find all sorts of explanations which are designed to take our attention away from what to me is the most persuasive explanation, that whenever you have two groups of people, and it doesn't really matter if they're Israelis or Palestinians, they could be black and white, they could be group A and group B. Whenever you have two groups of people, and one group has essentially a monopoly on economic, political, and military power, and the other group is almost totally deprived of this power, you have conflict. It's inevitable that there will be conflict. And this is the situation today in Palestine, Israel. So essentially, we need to find a way for these two groups of people to live together. And to have roughly equal access to political, economic power, resources, opportunities, and so on. Now, it's possible to imagine two ways to do this, two ways to break this impasse and to come up with something workable. Understanding that these two groups of people, that the status quo is unsustainable. One, of course, is the solution that has been advocated or adopted by much of the international community, around which there's a major consensus, and to say, well, the way to resolve this imbalance of power is to allow each group to attain its rights and its security and its freedom in a state of its own. So to say that there would be two states, Israel and Palestine. So broadly speaking, a two-state solution. I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. Another possible solution is to say, well, okay, the way to do this is to share power equally, to say that everyone living in this territory is equal, and to have a democracy in which everyone has a vote and everyone has equal rights. That's another possible solution. And if you reject both of those solutions, then the alternatives are those espoused on the Israeli right to say, well, let's get rid of Group B. So you have in Israel parties which advocate the quote-unquote transfer of the Palestinians, physically removing them from the territory. That way you have no more conflict between the two groups, and problem solved. Of course, that means that you're endorsing what fits the international legal definition of genocide, which was adopted after World War II. And there are views mirrored like that on the Palestinian side, who say that the only solution is to remove Group A or Group B, whichever side you're on, you decide which group it is. And those views are equally deluded. So, given that leaves us, if we want to reject, as I hope we all will, solutions based on the ethnic cleansing or genocide of another group, it leaves us with these two possibilities: a two-state solution or a one-state solution. One question which is very pressing is, if there's such an international consensus around a two-state solution, why don't we have it? We've had more than 10 years of negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians, involvement by every US administration since 1967, and yet we seem no closer. Well, let's talk about the basis of a two-state solution and look at some of these developments, and then maybe we can understand whether or not it has a possibility. The internationally accepted basis of a two-state solution is I'm just thinking about whether I can put some maps up. I'm not sure if I can. Okay, there we go. Perfect. Right. So I put it sideways. Why not put it sideways? What makes us think north is up? All right, this is confusing me. I'm putting it back this way. Okay. Well, you know what the bottom looks like now there, see? You've all seen this before. But this area is historic Palestine, Eretz Israel, again, whatever makes you feel comfortable. In 1948, Israel was established on 78% of this territory. And the result of that was the displacement, the physical displacement of 3/4 of the Palestinian population. And here's another map this is from I think from Walid Khalidi's book, All That Remains, or from Benny Morris's book, I don't recall, one of the two. But this just shows you Each one of these dots represents a Palestinian town or city that was depopulated in 1947-48. Over 400 towns and cities and 3/4 of the population displaced. So that's where Israel was created in 1948. And in 1967, Israel occupied the remainder of historic Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza. After that war, a consensus began to emerge around a two-state solution, based on the notion that Israel would withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem, occupied in 1967. In exchange, the Palestinians and the Arab states would recognize Israel within the area on which it was established in 1948. From the perspective of Palestinians, this represents an enormous historic compromise because this area, west of the River Jordan, had until 1948 an overwhelming Palestinian majority. Palestinians owned 90% of the land, and yet the historic compromise they were prepared to accept was to relinquish essentially the 78% of their country and accept a state in these two small areas which amount to 22% of the country. Now, this took decades. I mean, I won't go into all of the different steps that happened along the way, where a Palestinian consensus emerged around this. Eventually, this is now official US policy, that there should be a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. The problem, of course, is that Israel, since 1967, has taken the quite deliberate step of trying to make such a territorial partition impossible. How have they been doing that? Principally by building settlements in the West Bank and Gaza Strip with the stated purpose of making an Israeli withdrawal impossible. Israeli governments call it facts on the ground. We create facts on the ground, it then becomes impossible to draw a line and separate Palestinians from Israelis. And so, since the first Israeli settlements were established in 1968, the number of settlers in the West Bank and Gaza Strip has now reached about 400,000. And this is just a map of the larger settlements, which shows you how they're interspersed throughout the territory. So the position of the international community has been consistently, these settlements have to go, because if you accept the notion of a two-state solution, two countries for two peoples, then it's impossible that one country should settle by force a large segment of its civilian population in the heart of the other. It simply doesn't make sense. And although we had in 1993 a historic agreement between Palestinians and Israelis in which Palestinians recognized the state of Israel within the borders it was established in 1948, and it was believed by many Palestinians that this would lead to an eventual Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories. The Israeli policy of all governments has been to continue to expand the settlements in the occupied territories, so that from the time the Oslo Accord was signed in 1993 until today, Israel has actually doubled the number of settlers in the occupied territories. What does this mean in practice? Let me simplify it. If two of us are going to negotiate, if you and I are going to negotiate over how to slice a pizza, and we say we're going to see who's hungrier, who has more children, who worked harder, who gets more slices. And we're going to take, 10, 15 minutes to decide where to make the slices. Well, if during that negotiation I'm busy eating the pizza as fast as I can, then the negotiation becomes nonsensical. And this was the story of the Oslo process. So Israel was busy eating the pizza as fast as it could, expanding settlements all over the place. And the Israeli government always tries to present this as a very benign activity. You know, we're simply, you know, people moving and we can't stop people, and, you know, someone has a family and they want to, so we need more housing. Well, all of this is a not very good disguise for what's really going on. The process of settlement is a violent process. It requires extreme violence because, you know, let's imagine the Israelis trying to settle the West Bank with non-violence. Knock on the door. Good afternoon, Ali. I'm here from the Settlers Council. We have this family. They'd like to take over your house. We'd like you to relinquish it and your olive groves and your land. And we don't want to use any violence. Would you please move out of the way? Thank you. Of course, it's nonsensical. The Israeli settlement policy is one of organized, systematic violence against the entire civilian population in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, something which is well documented by Israeli, Palestinian human rights groups, international human rights groups, the UN, even the US government. It's not really in dispute. With the result that today, it seems, with the acceleration of the settlement process, again under the Sharon government, there's nowhere to draw a line. So all of this leads us to the point where the settlements are so firmly entrenched that we have to ask whether or not it's futile to continue along the line of a two-state solution. Now, some of the objections to this story, you know, I would tell you that basically this is the reason why the two-state solution has failed, because the side with the power has imposed its own solution on the ground by continuing to expand settlements throughout the territories. There are some alternative explanations which are heard frequently, which I would like to address briefly. One is that it's not settlements, it's not any of these things the Palestinians say it is. The problem is violence. Israel wants peace desperately, and we have done more than anyone for peace. Nobody is willing to do what we're willing to do for peace. But how can we talk about peace when Palestinians are blowing themselves up in pizzerias and in discotheques and in supermarkets? And if only the Palestinians stop the violence, they will see we're willing to make painful compromises for the sake of peace. And this is the line you hear repeatedly from representatives of the State of Israel and their advocates in the United States. Of course, for this to be believable, it requires us to, again, to allow the violence of the occupation to be invisible. Let me tell you what I mean. Of course, sending or going into an Israeli restaurant and blowing yourself up is an absolutely atrocious and reprehensible act, and is absolutely unacceptable. And Palestinian groups that advocate that or practice that are absolutely, in my view, beyond the pale of what is acceptable, even in the face of an unjust occupation. But let's look at violence in terms of where it's come from. In the first 20 years of the Israeli occupation, from 1967 to 1987, Israel faced relatively little violent resistance in the occupied West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. And yet, Israel was carrying out all of the practices which I spoke of: land confiscation, house demolition, violence against the civilian population, and so on. During the first Palestinian uprising against this occupation, which began in 1987, so if you take from the beginning of that uprising in December 1987 to the signing of the Oslo Accords, and you look at the numbers from the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, they have a website with a statistics page, and you can all go and look at it. And their numbers are conservative, because they even say that they're not able to document all Palestinian deaths. But let's take their numbers nevertheless. In that period of the first uprising, the number of Israeli civilians killed by Palestinians was 100 over a roughly 6-year period. That's 100 too many, don't get me wrong. I don't think a single Israeli civilian should have been harmed in that period, but 100 were killed. In the same period, according to B'Tselem, more than 1,100 Palestinian civilians were killed by the Israeli army. So you do the math. 11 to 1, roughly. 11 Palestinians killed for every Israeli killed. And that's not counting the tens of thousands of Palestinians permanently maimed, an entire generation of children denied schooling for 3 years. Imagine as say between the age of 6 and 9, or between 9 and 12, not going to school, how much that harms your development as a child. An entire generation lived through that, and yet, compared with now, Israeli civilians were relatively safe. In the current uprising, which began in the beginning of October 2000, until today, we've seen more than 2,500 Palestinians killed and more than 800 Israelis. And on both sides, the vast majority civilians. Now, and of those, about 400, over 400 Palestinian children have been killed, and about 100 Israeli children have been killed. And if you take the numbers overall, now you see how much less safe Israelis are, how much more violence there is overall, and how the ratio has narrowed. Now, for every Israeli killed, 3 Palestinians are being killed instead of 11. So, in fact, violence has increased over the past decade or so. And so if Israel were wanting a situation of less violence or no violence in which to make peace, it had it. Had it for many years, and all it did was take advantage of that to build settlements. So violence is a problem. It's a major catastrophe for both peoples, and it won't lead to anything. There are Palestinians who believe that if you can blow the Israelis into submission, I don't think you can. And there are Israelis who fantasize that with enough bombing, with enough assassinations, with enough curfews, with enough home demolitions, raising enough olive groves, and so on, that the Palestinians will be, quote unquote, defeated and will be content to live with whatever Israel gives them. In fact, over the years, Palestinian resistance and determination has only increased despite everything Israel has done. So violence in this case is a symptom of the underlying conflict. It is the result of this radical imbalance in power, which is accompanied by extreme, organized, and systematic ongoing process of dispossession of one group by the other. The other major objection to what I've told you as to why the two-state solution failed is, again, the badness of the Palestinians. You're required to believe that the Palestinians are somehow inherently, ontologically bad and unreasonable. And the argument goes like this, that we offered them everything they wanted in Camp David in the summer of 2000. A state in, depending on who you believe, 93% of the West Bank, 95% of the West Bank, 100%, and so on. In fact, this is something that was repeated so consistently in the media, with very little attention given to the underlying reality of what was being proposed. as I already mentioned, this historic compromise of Palestinians accepting 22% of their original homeland, and Israel saying in effect, no, that's too much for you. We want you to compromise on the compromise, and we want to take a large chunk of the West Bank for ourselves. So that in the varying permutations of the Camp David plan and then the Clinton plan and so on, in fact, what we know, and the accounts which came out later from people like Robert Malley and Hussein Ara and others, is that what the Palestinians were offered was not an end to the occupation, not statehood, not independence, but a sort of quasi-autonomy within a greater Israel. And it was completely unworkable, not to mention unjust. And this map simply shows you the sorts of proposals which were coming out, which show a so-called Palestinian state divided into many pieces, completely cut off and bisected by Israeli settler roads, and with most of the settlers, the vast majority, if not all of them, remaining exactly where they are. So in effect, simply a ratification of the territorial conquest Israel had made since 1967. So, since the failure of the Camp David negotiations, Israel has, let's see if we can get the computer up now. Israel has accelerated the process of making a partition impossible. And they've done this with the so-called security fence that they are now building in the West Bank. And again, this is another issue that has been addressed widely in the, is that coming up? Okay, let's see. Sometimes you can't find things on your own website. You have to give me a second here. Here we go. Just want to show you a few pictures. Here we go. Where Israel has been, again, trying to present this as simply a reasonable measure to protect its citizens against these awful suicide bombings. Of course, as I think no one can disagree, those kinds of bombings are horrendous. But what does the security wall do? I remember seeing the Berlin Wall in 1986 when I was on a school trip to East Berlin. And most of you are too young to really remember the Berlin Wall, but it was sort of this major feature of life. It sort of psychologically dominated and symbolized this artificial division between East and West. I remember seeing it and thinking, this is the most atrocious thing I've ever seen. The way it went down the middle of streets, the divided families and neighbors, the automated machine gun nests, which were technologically fairly rudimentary, but lethal nevertheless. The Checkpoint Charlie Museum showing documenting people's efforts to cross the wall and so on. I kept thinking that this is the most grotesque thing I've ever seen. And yet Israel is in the process of building something which is 4 times long as the Berlin Wall, roughly. And that's what we know about because they keep announcing new bits of it. But what's been published, and in places twice as high. And in fact, it's not really a wall as such, but a barrier which is sort of the width of a major interstate running through people's land and dividing, sometimes bisecting villages in two. And as you can see in places, see how high it is compared to the person standing there, bisecting people's fields and making life really quite difficult. Now, Again, one of the myths that is repeated constantly in the media is that this wall runs between Israel and the West Bank, and the Bush administration is annoyed because in places it veers over the line. In fact, 90% of the length of the wall, or barrier, whatever you want to call it, is inside the occupied West Bank. And in places it juts deep into the West Bank. And according to a report just released by the UN, about 700,000 of the 2 million Palestinians in the West Bank are directly affected by the wall. First of all, some 200,000, 250,000 are on one side of the wall, on the quote-unquote Israeli side, and separated from their families, their villages, their work, their schools, their places of worship, the other part of their country, on the other side. Huge numbers. I mean, you can look up the UN report. I think we have it on the site. It will be fairly easy to find. Hundreds of thousands of people on the quote-unquote Palestinian side will be separated from people on the other side and from their fields and so on. This wall, if and when completed, and there's no reason to believe it won't be completed, really forecloses on the possibility of any kind of sensible, workable, or minimally fair territorial compromise. New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman wrote in an op-ed on September 14th this year. He went to the West Bank city of Qalqilia, which is here. Qalqilia is a city of about 60,000 people, which is now completely surrounded by a wall. And there's a single gate for 60,000 people to enter or leave, which is open at the whim of the Israeli army. This is something that has been compared by many people to the ghettos of old Europe. That you simply fence in the undesirable population, out of sight, out of mind, and you can control them that way. This is what Thomas Friedman wrote a couple of months ago from Qalqilia. If there's one iron law that has shaped the history of Arab-Israeli relations, it's the law of unintended consequences. For instance, Israel is still wrestling with all the unintended consequences of its victory in 1967. Today, Israel is building a fence and walls around the West Bank to deter suicide bombers. But having looked at this wall extensively from both sides, I am ready to make a prediction. It will be the mother of all unintended consequences. Rather than create the outlines of a two-state solution, this wall will kill the idea for Palestinians and drive them over time to demand instead a one-state solution, where they and Jews have equal rights in one state. And since by 2010, there will be more Palestinian Arabs than Jews living in Israel, the West Bank and Gaza, in Israel, the West Bank and Gaza combined, this transformation of the Palestinian cause will be very problematic for Israel. If American Jews think it's hard to defend Israel today on college campuses, imagine what it will be like when their kids have to argue against the principle of one man, one vote. It might be tempting to say, great, well, that will solve the problem. Palestinians just have to hunker down and wait a few years, and the demographics will take care of the situation. And of course, this is what Israel is in fear of. This is why the Israeli Zionist left is desperate to come to some accommodation with the Palestinians, which would allow them to keep a Jewish majority and therefore a Jewish monopoly on political power within Israel, and why increasingly the Israeli right talks about solving the quote-unquote demographic problem by getting rid of the Palestinians. So from left to right in Israel, people are aware of the problem which Friedman enunciated. For Palestinians, it's easy to say, look, well, you know, the whole purpose of this two-state solution is really for Israel's benefit. We don't have that much to gain from it. because it's so costly for us in terms of what we have to give up. But it's not quite so simple. It's very tempting to say, look, if partition is impossible, and these populations now are so intertwined physically, and already you have equal numbers, 400,000 Israeli Jews in the occupied territories, 1.2 million Palestinians, citizens of Israel, within Israel. What's the point of trying to draw a line in this tiny territory? Let's go for the one-state solution. There are examples of that in recent history, the most notable and relevant being South Africa. Here was a situation where a powerful minority ruled a disenfranchised majority. And the solution was not to create a separate white state, as some whites demanded, and separate black states, as the apartheid government actually attempted in the 1970s and 80s, but to say, one person, one vote. So the question is, if that can happen in South Africa after 80 years of white supremacy, why not in Palestine, Israel? Look at our own history in this country. If after centuries of slavery, and then followed by apartheid in this country, we can have a constitution which promises equality before the law, and though we haven't achieved it yet, that's the standard we hold out and we work towards, why not in Palestine, Israel? And those are key questions. And some of the answers are very hard, and we have to really be brutally honest about them. One is that there's going to be a lot of opposition to this idea from Palestinians and from Israelis. I think more so from Israelis. If you look even at those examples such as South Africa and in this country, look at where the vision came from. Where did the vision for the new South Africa come from? Where did the vision for civil rights and equality in this country come from? It came from the oppressed group. It came from black South Africans and their allies, and it came from, not from Attorney General Bobby Kennedy or from JFK, but from those people who started the civil rights movement in this country. The unseen, unnamed, and unknown. That's where it started from. And that's an unfair burden, that those who are already burdened by oppression have to offer a vision essentially to their oppressors. But I would say Palestinians have failed to do that for the most part, in the sense that although they have recognized Israel, and on repeated occasions, formally and officially, the whole notion of a Palestinian state is completely different from the idea of reconciliation within one state. And so, even though Palestinians for many years, for many decades in fact, the sort of one-state solution was the official solution of the Palestinian national movement, it wasn't, I think, taken seriously by Palestinians, taken on board what it would really mean in terms of recognizing Israelis as being at home in Palestine, recognizing Palestine as a home for the Jewish people. And I think many Israelis feared, and not without reason, that this was simply a way of saying that it's another way to get Palestinian control. So if Palestinians want to be serious about this, they have to really start by engaging with Israelis and convincing them that what we're talking about is not Palestinian domination of Israelis, but a true partnership in which Jewish people, Jewish Israelis feel secure that they have a guaranteed future in their homeland as equals and as partners. And that's something that Palestinians have not done yet as a movement, although I think people like the late Edward Said really began to struggle with those issues in the past few years, and I think lit the path. Only then, I think, can you begin to convince Israelis that ending this anomalous situation, this disastrous situation, is not suicide, that it's actually a more hopeful future. And I think that if we don't begin to have this discussion, then we have to resign ourselves to perpetual conflict or some sort of catastrophe, that maybe the ethnic cleansers will win the day. And I'm not prepared to accept that, so we have to start the discussion about what a radical alternative to the current path would look like, in which if a Jew, an Israeli Jew, wants to live in Hebron, that's absolutely fine, as long as she comes as a citizen, as an equal, buys land or a house lawfully, and not as a settler with a gun. And if that can be the case, and if a Jewish Israeli can live securely in Hebron or Bethlehem or Nablus, why can't a Palestinian live securely and peacefully in Tel Aviv? If we cannot find a way to divide the land between these two groups, let's give both groups 100% of the land. That begins to make sense to me, but it's very hard work to convince people of that. But I think that we have to start the discussion, because certainly the situation for Palestinians is catastrophic. They've been through so much in the past decades and in the past few years of Israeli attempts to defeat the will to resist. But also the crisis within Israel cries out for a radical alternative. Look at what some Israelis are saying. Recently, there was an article by Avram Berg, the former Speaker of the Israeli Knesset, and a mainstream Zionist from the Labour Party, and he was Speaker of the Knesset for 4 years, from 1999 to 2003. And he wrote an article that absolutely surprised many people, and was printed in The Guardian last September. And he says, he starts, "The Zionist revolution has always rested on two pillars, a just path and an ethical leadership." Now, you may or may not agree with that, but that's his perspective on what Zionism is or was or ought to be. Neither of these is operative any longer. The Israeli nation today rests on a scaffolding of corruption and on foundations of oppression and injustice. As such, the end of the Zionist enterprise is already on our doorstep. There is a real chance that ours will be the last Zionist generation. There may yet be a Jewish state here, but it will be a different sort, strange and ugly. And he talks about this issue of violence I talked about earlier. Israel, he says, we have grown accustomed to ignoring the suffering of the women at the roadblocks. I'm just giving you a snippet. But there's copies outside which you can pick up. No wonder we don't hear the cries of the abused woman living next door or the single mother struggling to support her children in dignity. We don't even bother to count the women murdered by their husbands. He's talking about within Israeli society itself. Israel, having ceased to care about the children of the Palestinians, should not be surprised when they come washed in hatred and blow themselves up in the centers of Israeli escapism. They consign themselves to Allah in our places of recreation because their own lives are torture. They spill their own blood in our restaurants in order to ruin our appetites because they have children and parents at home who are hungry and humiliated. We could kill 1,000 ringleaders a day and nothing will be solved because the leaders come up from below, from the wells of hatred and anger, and from the, quote, infrastructures of injustice and moral corruption. Now, that's someone from the sort of mainstream Israeli left, but it's not only there. Just on the 14th, the Israeli paper Haaretz published some comments. Actually, they came... I forgot to turn my phone off. That's a major faux pas, to be in a lecture and have your phone ring. So, okay. In interviews with the Israeli daily Yedi'ot Ahronot, just last week, 4 former heads of the Israeli security service, the Shin Bet, made some comments. And the Shin Bet, the Israeli internal security service, is not known generally as a center of, let's say, singing Kumbaya. They're responsible for a lot of very nasty things, from torture to extrajudicial killings and so on. And one of the former security chiefs, Yaakov Peri, said, quote, "We are heading downhill towards near catastrophe. If nothing happens and we go on living by the sword, we will continue to wallow in the mud and destroy ourselves." He continued, "We need to take the situation into our own hands and leave Gaza with all the difficulty that entails, and to dismantle illegal settlements." I think even more startling were the words of former Shin Bet chief Avraham Shalom, which I think really echo the words of Avraham Berg. He says, "We must once and for all admit there is another side, that it has feelings, that it is suffering, and that we are behaving disgracefully. This entire behavior is the result of the occupation." Those aren't the only such comments. The Israeli press is full of them, because Israel too is, the current situation is simply unsustainable. Look at the situation. 5 million Israeli Jews cannot forever hold in check 5 million Palestinians, let alone the entire world that is increasingly becoming revolted with Israeli action. A recent poll showed that 59% of citizens of the European Union view Israel as a threat to world peace, as one of the greatest threats to world peace. Of course, there were those in Israel who were quick to say it's anti-Semitism, but more careful voices are recognizing that what Israel does has an impact on its view around the world. Israel's economic situation is disastrous. Foreign direct investment went from a level of about $100 billion a year just before the Palestinian uprising to virtually nil now, to a negligible amount, according to the Bank of Israel. Also, according to the Bank of Israel, the number of families living below the poverty line in Israel among Israeli Jews has tripled in the past decade. 1 in 3 Israeli children now lives below the poverty line. This mirrors what's happening in our country in terms of the ever-increasing proportion of our national wealth that goes to so-called defense, while nearly 50 million people have no right to see a doctor in this country. And Israel is following the same path as we also follow Israel's path of military occupation. So within Israel, the situation is unsustainable. Sharon places his hope in getting 1 million Jews to emigrate into Israel from around the world to quote unquote solve the demographic problem. That's a fantasy. There aren't 1 million Jews in the world willing to move to Israel. There aren't 100,000 willing to move to Israel, partly because the reserves, that's the word that Sharon uses, aren't there, and because Israel is such an unattractive place to live now. In fact, there's more people emigrating from Israel than immigrating. And Israel doesn't publish numbers about this for reasons that are certainly understandable, because the propaganda effect of those numbers becoming known is disastrous for Israel, but there are signs of it everywhere. Just in the past couple of days again, and these reports appear every few months, the number of Israelis who are going to, remember, Israel is supposedly the refuge of the Jewish people. They came from Eastern Europe, where Jews were in fact oppressed for centuries. And now Israelis are going to the embassies of Poland and all the countries of Eastern Europe and trying to get their citizenship back because their parents or grandparents might have come from Poland. So they're trying to reclaim the citizenships of their ancestors because those countries will be part of the EU within a couple of years, and the EU is a much more attractive place to live. If I were to stand here and tell you, if the Bush administration does this and Israel does that, and then we'll have two states, I think that I would be deceiving you, because the prognosis is this, and let's be clear about it. Israel is going to keep building settlements. Even on the Israeli left today, there isn't a core constituency willing to contemplate what it would take to make a two-state solution work, a genuine end to the occupation. Even the so-called Geneva Accord, negotiated by some Palestinian Authority people and a group of former Israeli officials from the Labour Party, talks about keeping most of the settlers in place, talks about giving Israel virtually all of Jerusalem that it annexed since 1967. This is unworkable. So if there's no prospect for a two-state solution, then the choice before us is to resign ourselves to eternal conflict or to start looking for a more hopeful alternative. The fact that most Israelis might oppose it now, or most American Jews might oppose it now, or most Palestinians might oppose it now, is not a deterrent to that, because it's never been seriously talked about. We've never seriously talked about a radically different proposal to resolve this conflict and to give both peoples 100% of the country. And it seems so obvious to me because this is what's in tune with our values. The notion of ethno-national states in which people are divided into neat groups with defined boundaries is an idea that comes out of the 19th century and is an idea which has wrought more devastation to the world than almost any other. So let's start talking about that. And maybe then, in a few years, maybe longer, we'll live to see peace. Thank you.